Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today is number 450 to bear that title, which means doing something a little bit different, a little bit cool, and something I wanted to tackle for a while. The T-55 is a truly venerable piece of equipment, and it is still in service with some armed forces around the world. Certainly during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, if you were ever looking at doing, fictional conflicts between made-up countries, imaginations of the modern era, you're probably going to have a T-55 in your collection. And even if not, if you're playing real Soviets, then you're definitely going to want one. So this is actually a 3D print. This comes from a Bob Mack 3D STL. This was a recent Kickstarter, so I'm not sure that it's available for purchase just yet, but keep your eye on his store. I will make sure to link that in the description. The methods here are all pretty simple. We're not going to push the boat out too far, but we're going to have some fun. So, as always, paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. So of course, first of all, once you have assembled your miniature, whether it be a resin print or a plastic kit, it is time to go ahead and prime it. Now I've used here Russian Uniform from Vallejo. It does come in a primer spray, which is extremely handy. If you can't get your hands on it though, then what I would suggest would be to pick a mid-grey, something like Uniform Grey from the Army Painter or Mechanica Standard Grey from Citadel, and use that instead. Then you're going to need to go over the tank a couple of times with a thin coat of Russian Uniform World War II from the pot. It's a really handy generic sort of army man green with just a little touch of yellow to it. Now I've got the turret here just so that you can see that it is done. Obviously everything I'm going to do to the hull on screen will also be done to the turret, so we'll put that aside for a second. So once we've got the green down, what we're going to do is our shading straight away. I'll pop this aside for a second because we need to mix up our wash. So what I've gone ahead and mixed up here, this is a half and half mix of Grimdark Shadow and Speed Paint Medium. Now Grimdark Shadow is quite a lot darker than what you'll find in things like Athonian Camo Shade or Military Shader. It is a black green rather than just a dark green. So you could try mixing, dark tone and Military Shader or something together, but if you can get your hands on the Grimdark Shadow, why not use it? So, once we've got our mix all ready to go, what we'll do is just apply it over the entire miniature. As you'll see, it's pretty dark, but that is exactly what we want. Now, once you've got it on these flat panels, just take a second to smooth it out a little bit. But yeah, make sure it's getting into every nook and cranny. This is a simple, if a little messy step. So you'll see I've got the glove on there because this will get out of control real quick. So over everything that's going to be green, away we go. Now it is important that you leave that to dry for as long as possible. Reason being, if anything is still wet when we come to this stage, what you're going to do is pick it up with your overbrushing and smear it around. It will make a god-awful mess. So patience is your watchword here, even if it's unpleasant. What I have got here is actually a makeup brush. This is one of the little cheap ones from off of Amazon. I'm liking these for this job particularly because they're a little bit softer than the dry brushes that you tend to pick up from most companies, selling dry brushes. I want a soft bristled brush for this. What I've got then is some Russian Uniform from the pot, and starting on the top, just to get a feel for what I'll leave behind, I'm going to go ahead and basically overbrush the entire miniature again with Russian Uniform to bring up some of the flat panels and start introducing a little bit more depth to what we've done. As at the moment, it's roughly the right shade of green, but it's a little bit flat. Now see on some of these larger, flatter areas that we've got, it's looking a little bit nicer, more smooth. I'm going to pop the turret aside again, and before you go ahead and rinse off the brush that you've been using to do that, now what I've mixed up, this is 2 parts dark sand to 4 parts of Russian Uniform. And this is going to be our first sort of overbrush color. Now this time, I don't want to completely change up the color of the tank. What I'm doing is just concentrating towards the edges of areas where I want a little bit of color modulation. It's going to be a little bit patchy at first. You find that you won't get a perfect smooth edge. But that is fine, because I do want a slightly scratchy, a rough edge to everything, as though some parts are catching the light a little more regularly, they haven't been stepped on as often, all sorts of reasons why a slightly rougher finish here is going to look better and more realistic. So this time we are doing the same thing, going over the whole tank, but we're not looking to completely change the color. We're just concentrating here on higher areas of the tank. Alright, so there's our tank so far. As you can see, there's a little bit of texture to it, but I'm not too concerned about that. That is going to play out as we carry on. So once again, pop the turret aside. And what I've done is to mix in another couple of drops of dark sand. This is now sort of eyeballing it. This is closer to half and half of each Russian uniform and dark sand. This time I'm going to go for a flat-edged brush for our dry brushing, because now what I want is to start catching the edges of things. So along the toolboxes, front panels and what have you, now we're really catching the detail and making those edges stand out compared to the rest of the vehicle. You can overdo this, although you kind of have to try to. You can concentrate on some of the flat panels, especially on the upper hull. It won't look too weird if those have caught a little bit more sun. But away we go. Same process, just using the flat brush, because you'll be able to angle it to catch the edges of detail a little bit more easily than a rounded edge brush. Now there is the color, the main body of the tank done. You might notice if you've watched a video I did on painting British armor, it's a very, very similar technique. The main difference is that we've used the dark sand rather than Iraqi sand to mix into our highlights, because we want to lean into the yellowish sort of tint to it. It's a little more accurate, at least I would say, for most of the Soviet vehicles I've seen. What I'm going to do is put the tank aside for a moment, and we're going to pick up the turret. I have here Prairie Ochre from the Army painter, and we're going to paint this over the canvas cover on the gun here. Now while that first coat of that is drying, I'm going to flip it around, and I have here Khaki from Vallejo. We're going to paint in this canvas color here. Now with those two base coated, we are going to shade them in a little bit, but there's one more thing that we have to paint, which is going to be the bridging log, which is the classiest funky thing here, attached to the back of the T-55. Now remembering of course here that we are painting a wooden log, so you can pretty much use any color you like, but I'm using Paratrooper Tan from the Army painter because the coverage there is just wonderful. Now once those three colors have dried, what I've done is to mix up some strong tone in the same way as I did with the Grimdark Shadow we used, just half and half with a little bit of speed paint medium. We're going to apply this over the three colors that we've just painted on. Now I'd always recommend, when you first come across a shade or a wash, whatever it is you're using, have a wee experiment with thinning it down just a little at first until you find what you like, because they can be quite strong when they first come out of the pot, but of course the point of thinning them out is to modulate that a bit, so you've got a better chance of putting them on the way that you'd like. Now while they're dry, so long as you're careful, we can move on to the next step. What I've got here is German grey. This is my go-to for black, normally metal and stuff like that, and it's also brilliant for rubber. So the rubber road wheels is where we're going to start with this, and this bit can be a little time consuming, but luckily don't worry if you hit the tracks, because the tracks we are going to paint in the same color. I tend to find it easiest to start by painting one side of all the wheels, and then flip it upside down, well the right way up in this instance, to do the same thing again from the opposite side. So you're repeating the motion as much as possible. You'll find you get pretty good at it. I tend to find it easiest at this stage to swap on down to a flat edge brush, so I can really work it into where the tracks are, and thin down that German grey just a little bit more than you normally would. You can see I've made a bit of a pig's ear of it on this side. I've gotten some of that all over the wheels. I'm not too concerned though, because as we come to weather this, I'm going to cover over most of that. I'm really not all that fussed. But once I've done that on the tracks, we also need to do that to a couple of bits on the turret. Now, quite a few of you were telling me that there was no MGs on the T-55. However, the T-55A in 1970 had a modernization program which included an AA mount ring for the Dushka machine gun, and yeah, paint that black. Now once this had plenty of time to dry, well, you'll see straight away I'm not painting the underside, but what we're going to do over the tracks themselves is quite a generous overbrush, and I'm using here oily steel. So pass over that a couple of times. Don't worry if you do fill in some of the black stuff underneath. And when it comes to the sides here, just buff along the edges fairly carefully with your brush. Now once that's dried thoroughly, and it is important that it has really dried, because if we slop this stuff over the top and it hasn't dried properly, you're going to get an awful mess by lifting up the silver stuff underneath. Now what I'm applying, this is the rust wash. This is dark rust specifically, and keeping the whole tank in shot while I do this is a mission. And when you first squirt this out onto your palette, you're going to see that it's actually quite thick. It is more like a paste almost. So what I've done is to mix this down half and half with war paint stabilizer. You could give it a shot with water. It would probably give you a very similar result. All I want to do is just make sure that I'm not chucking on, thick glunk. What I want is the color mostly, and we're going to get a little bit of our metallic stuff showing through. This looks absolutely vile going on. Like, I know, trust me, but as it dries, you're going to see something interesting happen. So, keep the faith and apply this all over your tracks. Now once that has dried, if I flip it over here and we have a look at the bottom, you'll see some of the silver is still showing through. That's part of the reason why I like that this comes as thick as it does, because it lets you control by thinning it down what kind of effect you get. Still, this is a little bit darker than I would like, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and grab some oily steel again, but this time be a little bit more sparing in how much of it goes back on. You could skip quite a few of those steps by just turning around and maybe priming or base coating the tracks in something like burnt umber. But there is a little bit of texture to this rust effect, which I find works super well. It's subtle, and you probably won't see very much of it on camera. But remember, we're dealing with miniatures, so subtle is good. Now again, one of those colors that's a little difficult to see on camera, but trust me, in person, that looks pretty cool. So what we're going to do is put the hull aside for a second, and we're actually going to turn to the turret. Now what I'm starting with for these big lamps, this is Triumphant Navy. Now I am going to use a couple of different blue paints to give this effect, but what I'd suggest is that you don't necessarily need to buy 3 blue paints just for this. If you want to save a few pennies, just pick up a real dark one like this, and you can mix in some white for the following 2 stages. Because I have them, it would be silly not to use them though. So, Triumphant Navy first of all on the lamps that you want to blue up. Now with a lighter blue, here I'm using ultramarine blue, we're going to aim to paint about 1/3 of the lamp with kind of a crescent shape. Now if you put too much of this on, or it blobs out in a direction you don't like, you can go back to the Triumphant Navy or whatever you're using for your base color and smooth it out a bit, like an undo button. I think I might end up doing that myself. And now, with some barren blue, we're going to paint just a tiny little sliver right at the edge. And this is actually adapted from an old gem painting technique I saw in a White Dwarf. I would have been 16 at the time, so that's some years ago now. Then finally, to give it a little bit of ding, what we'll do is a tiny wee spot of white in one... Now I keep wanting to say corner. You would know what I meant if I said corner, but I'm aware that this is a round thing, so it has no corners, so don't quote me on that. But dots in the corners, okay? Alright, now, if you have got any transfers that you want to use, now's the time to apply them. I'm going to keep it quite simple, and I am just going to pop a turret number on. This is the Rubicon sheet, and you can see there's a huge range of Soviet-aligned and sort of later Cold War, modern era stuff that you can pop on there. I'm not going to put a like a national or an army sigil on there because I want this to be fairly generic for my purposes. But any transfers that you do have, pop them on now before you do your weathering. Now I have told a little lie because I did go ahead and apply a couple of red stars. I figure no matter what army this thing's going to be deployed to, a red star is a safe bet. What we're going to do is pop the turret off for a second again because now we're going to do our weathering. And here, first of all, I have a little bit of packing foam. You see you get these in metal boxes and that sort of stuff. I'm going to work it into just a little almost brush shape. Dab it into some German camo black brown and dab most of it off onto a bit of kitchen towel. Now, let's get this in shot. What we'll do is use this to create random little chipped edges along the leading edges of the tank. You can also pop it on areas where you'd see, it hits things or crew climb over. Now it is pretty easy to go wildly overboard with this. So occasionally, stop what you're doing, hold your thing out at arm's length and get a look at what you're actually leaving behind. Don't just keep doing it because you've got the brush in your hand. So I'm going to add a little bit of this all over the metal work where I want to look a little bit dinged, a little bit stepped on, where there's been activity. And again, subtle is good. And once you're done with this, make sure to do the same along the turret. So now it's starting to feel a little more lived in. Now what I've got here is one of my little makeup brushes, and I have actually wet it. Dip it in a little bit of water. Doesn't need to soak, just enough that it is damp. Work most of that out onto some kitchen towel. Then what I'm going to do is get a little bit of flat earth. Dip my brush into it, just a little bit on the end of the bristles. And that same splodging motion, this is where we're going to add our road dirt. So we're going to go ahead and fairly liberally just start splattering this. Doesn't matter if it is, accurate at all. What we want is really just to break up some of the color and add a little bit of brown and gunk to our green. And after you've got a little bit of it on the front here, and you've worked most of it into your bristles, it's a little bit dry, you're not leaving very much behind. What you can do is start smudging this onto flat areas of the tank where you would see that road dust starting to collect. So you don't need to go crazy with it, but particularly on the engine decking and what have you, give it a little circular scrub with your worn out brush and then just make sure that too much of it isn't being left behind. So now what I'm doing is I have mixed up, first of all, just 2 drops of red leather and then 12 drops of the War Paints stabilizer, which I mentioned earlier. Now you could just as easily do this with water. It doesn't have to be stabilizer. But what I'm doing is just picking areas where a little bit of rainwater is likely to have collected and would get some rust. Now, you don't need to go crazy with this. Most crews are going to take relatively good care of their vehicles after all. However, you might have a tank from a nation or from a warlord group that doesn't take terribly good care of their vehicles. So this, it is very easy to go overboard with. You can smudge it around if you have to. But yeah, I'm going to apply a bit of this to some of this tank now. Alright, what I'm going to do now is take this outside and hit it with a matte varnish spray. I'm going to use the Color Forges matte varnish for this one. And then there are just 2 more steps. I'm going to add a little bit of gloss varnish on the lamps so that they shine a little. I'm going to do that off camera, but there's one more step I want to show you. And then that last little trick is to grab yourself a soft pencil, something like a B or a 2B. B is better, the softer you can get. And what I'm going to do is anywhere that there is a prominent little patch of scuffed up metalwork, just to buff the edge of it with the pencil. You can do this along the tracks. You can do this along parts that haven't had any sort of dinging or anything. But basically, this will give you a little fresh bit of exposed steel. So you want to be mindful you don't add too much of this, because the more of this that goes on, the more recent and shiny the damage is going to look. So yeah, be restrained if you can. And then once I'm finished with this, we'll call them done. We'll go ahead, And pop them on the whizzy thing, see if it will fit in such a way that I can show it off. And so, there at last, our venerable T55 is complete. Now, there are a lot of things you could do to continue painting this, in particular highlighting things like the gun mantlet or the canvas on the back of the turret, but sometimes you've got to ask yourself, is the extra work going to add all that much to the finished product? And honestly, once you've done all the weathering and stuff, these things look cool as they are. I am glad I decided to add a couple of the decals. The bright yellow splash there really adds quite a bit, so I'm very happy with that. So, as always, thank you very much goes out to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me, goodness me, 450 times I've done this. You'd think I'd probably have it down by now. Anyway, the folks that are supporting the channel, thank you very much for your support, including my gorgeous producers who should be showing up on screen now unless I've messed that up as well. Who knows? It's early days yet. So, any questions or anything, folks, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked there too. So, finally, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.